forget your favorite reality TV show. Before the cameras and the drama, there was a family that practically invented dynastic chaos. For centuries, the Habsburgs, Europe's most powerful ruling house, were locked in a never-ending power struggle. It wasn't just about crowns and castles. It was about blood, betrayal, and brothers battling brothers. These aren't just dusty history lessons. These are the shocking real-life sagas that changed the map of Europe. Get ready for the 8 disputes that rocked the continent, one royal scandal at a time. Number 1. The Burgundian inheritance and Maximilian I's marriage. The year was 1477, and Europe was holding its breath. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, a man whose ambition was as vast as his treasury, had fallen in battle, leaving behind no son, only a single, incredibly wealthy daughter. Suddenly, this young woman, barely 20 years old, became the most sought-after bride in all of Christendom. Her lands, stretching from the North Sea down to what is now France, were a jewel box of prosperous cities, fertile farmlands, and strategic ports. Whoever married Mary would inherit a power base that could reshape the balance of European might. It was a prize almost too tempting to resist, and the kings and princes of Europe knew it. Mary herself was no wilting flower. She was intelligent, spirited, and acutely aware of the precarious position she found herself in. Her father's sudden death had left a massive power vacuum, and her own subjects, particularly the powerful cities of Flanders, were demanding concessions, eager to claw back rights and privileges that Charles the Bold had curtailed. As if that wasn't enough, King Louis, the 11th of France, Charles the Bold's lifelong rival, wasted no time. He immediately marched his troops into Burgundy, claiming portions of Mary's inheritance for himself, arguing that some of her father's territories were French fiefs that should revert to the crown without a male heir. Louis was known as the universal spider for his cunning and his web of intrigues, and he saw Mary's predicament as his moment to finally break the Burgundian power that had so long annoyed France. In this high-stakes game of thrones, Mary had very few allies. She knew she needed a strong protector, and she needed one fast. Suitors flooded her court, each promising security, but also demanding immense power for themselves. Among them was the French Dauphin Charles, who was still a child. Louis XI desperately wanted to marry Mary to his son, effectively absorbing Burgundy into France without firing another shot. But Mary, deeply wary of Louis and his grasping nature, knew such a marriage would reduce her to a mere puppet. She wanted a partner who would respect her autonomy and help her defend her lands. Enter Maximilian of Austria, the young son of Emperor Frederick III. Maximilian was handsome, athletic, and possessed a dashing chivalrous reputation. He was also a Habsburg, and the Habsburgs even then were known for their strategic marriages. Maximilian's father, Frederick, might have been slow and cautious, but he understood the immense potential of the Burgundian prize. He saw it as a chance to dramatically expand Habsburg influence and wealth. Messages flew back and forth between Brussels and the Habsburg court. Mary and Maximilian had never met, but they corresponded, exchanging portraits and letters, building a connection that was part political necessity, part genuine attraction. Contemporary accounts suggest Mary found Maximilian's portrait pleasing and his promises of protection reassuring. The pressure on Mary was immense. Her own counselors were divided. Some urged her to accept the French offer, arguing it was the only way to avoid war. Others, seeing the threat to Burgundian independence, championed Maximilian. But Mary, with a surprising strength of will, made her own choice. She sent a secret envoy to Maximilian, pleading with him to come to her aid quickly. She was effectively choosing her husband and her protector in a desperate bid to save her inheritance from being swallowed whole by France. Maximilian, for his part, understood the urgency. He gathered what meager funds his father would grant him. Frederick III was notoriously frugal and set out with a small retinue, racing against time and the machinations of Louis XI. His journey was fraught with danger, traveling through territories that were either openly hostile or deeply suspicious. When he finally arrived in Ghent in August 1477, Mary was there to greet him. Their first meeting, a moment fraught with so much political consequence, was reportedly one of mutual admiration. She saw in him the strong, decisive partner she needed, and he saw in her not only a vast inheritance, but also a woman of considerable spirit. Their wedding took place shortly after a brushed but significant ceremony. It was not a lavish affair given the circumstances, but its impact reverberated across Europe. This marriage, often cited as a prime example of the Habsburg motto, "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria marry," instantly transformed the Habsburg fortunes. They were no longer merely an important German princely house. They were now intertwined with the immense wealth and strategic importance of Burgundy. But Louis XI of France was not one to accept defeat gracefully. He saw the marriage as a direct challenge, a theft of what he believed was rightfully his. He immediately intensified his military actions against the Burgundian territories, sparking a series of brutal wars that would rage for years. The conflict became known as the Burgundian Succession War, and it pitted the newly strengthened Habsburg-Burgundian alliance against the relentless French monarchy. Battles were fought over strategic towns and fortresses, each side desperately trying to gain an advantage. Maximilian, despite his limited resources, proved himself a capable military commander, leading his troops in defense of his wife's inheritance. The early years of their marriage were dominated by this fierce struggle. Mary, pregnant soon after their wedding, continued to play a vital role, using her influence with her subjects to gather support and funds for the war effort. Their union produced 2 children quickly: Philip the Handsome, born in 1478, and Margaret of Austria, born in 1480. These children were crucial, solidifying the new Habsburg claim to Burgundy and ensuring the continuity of the dynasty. However, tragedy struck just 5 years into their marriage. In March 1482, Mary of Burgundy, while out hawking, was thrown from her horse. She suffered severe internal injuries. Despite the best efforts of her physicians, her condition worsened rapidly. Her death, just weeks later, at the age of 25, plunged Maximilian into deep grief and left him with the daunting task of securing his young children's inheritance. It also reignited the dynastic dispute. Louis XI, seeing another opportunity, pressed his claims even harder, arguing that, with Mary gone, the Burgundian lands should revert to France. Maximilian had to fight tooth and nail to retain control, particularly for his infant son Philip, who was now the rightful Duke of Burgundy. The struggle for the Burgundian inheritance would continue for decades, shaping the early modern map of Europe and setting the stage for future Habsburg-French rivalries that would define centuries of European history. Number 2. The Imperial election of 1519. The year 1519 promised to be one of the most explosive in European history, and it all revolved around a single highly coveted prize: the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor. The current emperor, Maximilian I, had died, leaving the vast, sprawling empire leaderless. This was no ordinary kingdom. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of hundreds of independent states, free cities, and powerful bishoprics, loosely bound together under the nominal authority of an elected emperor. But this emperor, while elected by a select group of 7 powerful princes, known as electors, wielded immense prestige and potentially significant power. To be emperor meant to be seen as the temporal head of Christendom, a counterpoint to the Pope in Rome. This election was not just about a title, it was about global dominance. 3 young, ambitious monarchs threw their hats into the ring, each believing they were destined for the imperial throne. First was Charles I of Spain. Maximilian's own grandson, Charles was already a powerhouse. He had inherited the vast Spanish kingdoms, including their burgeoning American empire, the 2 Sicilies, and thanks to his paternal grandmother, the rich Burgundian lands, he was by far the wealthiest and most powerful candidate. He spoke little German, was often reserved, and preferred the company of his Spanish and Burgundian advisors, but he carried the weight of the Habsburg legacy and his grandfather's dying wish for him to succeed. As emperor, His chief rival was Francis, the First of France. Francis was everything Charles was not: flamboyant, médic, a patron of the arts, and deeply proud of his French heritage. He saw the imperial crown as a natural extension of his kingdom's growing power, a way to surround and perhaps even eclipse the emerging Habsburg dominance. He was convinced that Europe should be led by a French king, not a Spanish one. He poured vast sums of money into bribing the electors, promising them everything from titles to territories. He played on their fears of a Habsburg superstate, arguing that Charles's immense inherited lands would create an empire too powerful for Europe's balance. The third contender, a dark horse but still a formidable presence, was Henry VIII of England. Young, ambitious, and with a thirst for glory, Henry saw the imperial title as a way to elevate England's standing on the European stage. He might have been geographically peripheral, but he had significant wealth and a growing navy. He, too, tried to sway the electors with promises and gold, though his chances were always considered slimmer than his two main rivals. The electors themselves were a colorful cast of characters, each with their own agendas and allegiances. There were the three ecclesiastical electors, the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier. And then there were the four secular electors: the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. These men understood the immense power they held. Their votes were literally for sale, and the price was climbing by the day. The campaigns were not fought on battlefields but in backrooms, through secret envoys and with mountains of gold. Agents from Charles, Francis, and Henry crisscrossed Germany, delivering sacks of ducats and promising future favors. The electors, knowing they had the upper hand, skillfully played the candidates against each other, driving up the bids. Letters from the time reveal the sheer scale of the financial inducements. Francis I famously declared he would spend 3 million livres to secure the crown, while Charles's agents were instructed to outbid him at every turn. Charles, despite his vast wealth, had to take out enormous loans from powerful banking families like the Fuggers of Augsburg. Jacob Fugger, the head of the banking house, was said to have told Charles directly that without his money, Charles would not have secured the imperial crown. The election became less about merit and more about who could offer the most compelling combination of cash, promises, and veiled threats. Francis tried to appeal to the German electors' sense of national pride, arguing that a foreign ruler like Charles, with his Spanish and Burgundian roots, would not understand their needs. He also warned them that Charles, if elected, would become too powerful and would inevitably try to curtail their hard-won freedoms. Charles, on the other hand, leveraged his Habsburg lineage and his grandfather's legacy. He also had the support of the Pope, Leo X, who, despite initial reservations about Habsburg power, ultimately preferred Charles over Francis, fearing French dominance in Italy. As the day of the election approached, the tension mounted. The city buzzed with the retinues of the candidates, the agents, the bankers, and the spies, all waiting for the decision that would reshape Europe inside the election chamber. The debates were fierce. Arguments about maintaining the liberties of the German princes, the threat of foreign influence, and the balance of power filled the air. Some electors genuinely feared Charles's power. Others were simply holding out for the highest price. In the end, it was Charles's combination of immense wealth, his grandfather's carefully laid groundwork, and perhaps a subtle recognition that he was the lesser of two evils in the eyes of some electors who feared Francis's direct ambition, that won the day. The Fugger banking house, in particular, played a critical role, providing the colossal sums necessary to secure the votes. On June 28, 1519, the electors cast their ballots. Charles I of Spain was elected emperor. For Francis I, it was a bitter defeat, a personal humiliation that fueled his lifelong rivalry with Charles. For Henry VIII, it was a recognition of his limitations on the continental stage. For Charles V, it was the culmination of his family's long-held ambitions, placing him at the head of an empire on which the sun never set. He now controlled not only Spain, the Americas, and Burgundy, but also the vast, complex, and often unruly Holy Roman Empire. This concentration of power was unprecedented and immediately threw Europe into a new era of intense competition and conflict. The stage was now set for decades of epic rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Valois dynasty of France, a rivalry that would define the first half of the 16th century and ignite numerous wars across the continent, all stemming from this pivotal election. Number 3. The division of the Habsburg monarchy, 1556. A man who has held the weight of the world on his shoulders for decades, a man who has ruled more territory than any European monarch before him. That was Emperor Charles V. By the mid-1550s, he was a tired, ailing man, plagued by gout, depression, and the sheer exhaustion of managing an empire so vast, it literally stretched across continents. His reign had been a relentless series of wars, religious upheavals, and political struggles against the French, the Ottomans, and the Protestant princes within his own Holy Roman Empire. He had dreamt of a universal monarchy, a unified Christian Europe. But the reality was a collection of disparate lands, often at odds with each other, all demanding his attention. Charles had long recognized that his empire was simply too large for one man to govern effectively. The vast distances, the different languages, cultures, and political systems made centralized control almost impossible. He had also come to terms with the failure of his grand vision for religious unity, having just concluded the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which formally recognized the division of Christianity within the Holy Roman Empire. He felt he had failed in his divinely appointed mission. The pressures, both personal and political, had become unbearable. So, Charles V, in a move almost unheard of for a reigning monarch, decided to abdicate. He would step down from his thrones, one by one, and retire to a monastery. But the question remained, who would inherit this immense sprawling empire? Charles had two immediate heirs, his only legitimate son, Philip II, and his younger brother Ferdinand. This was where the Great Dynastic Dispute, or rather the Great Dynastic Division, truly took shape. For years there had been an unspoken tension, a silent rivalry between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family. Charles had always envisioned Philip as his primary successor, inheriting the bulk of his power. Philip was educated in Spain, deeply Catholic, and steeped in the traditions of the Spanish monarchy. He was serious, industrious, and somewhat reserved, much like his father. However, Charles's brother Ferdinand had been governing the Austrian Habsburg lands for decades. He had been elected King of Bohemia and Hungary in 1526, securing those vital territories for the family. He had also served as King of the Romans since 1531, making him the presumptive heir to the imperial crown. Ferdinand was a more pragmatic ruler, more adept at navigating the complex politics of the Holy Roman Empire and dealing with the German princes. He spoke German, was familiar with the customs, and had cultivated relationships that Philip lacked. The issue was how to divide the inheritance without causing an open family feud, and how to ensure both branches remained powerful and supportive of each other. Charles knew that a complete transfer of all his titles to Philip would be deeply unpopular in the Holy Roman Empire. The German princes did not want a ruler who was primarily Spanish, who spoke no German, and whose interests lay far to the west. They preferred Ferdinand, who was familiar and had governed them for years. The decision to split the family's vast holdings was not made lightly. Charles wrestled with it for years. Letters exchanged between him, Philip, and Ferdinand revealed the complexities and the careful negotiations. Ultimately, Charles decided that the burden was too great for one man, and the separate interests of the Spanish and imperial crowns necessitated a formal division. This decision, in effect, created two distinct branches of the Habsburg dynasty: the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs, each with their own vast domains but forever intertwined by blood and common strategic interests. The first step was Charles's abdication of his Burgundian lands and the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily. In a solemn ceremony in Brussels in October 1555, Charles, supported by a staff due to his gout, tearfully handed over his authority to Philip II. He delivered a moving speech, recounting his long reign and expressing his hopes for his son. It was a dramatic public spectacle witnessed by the Knights of the Golden Fleece and his loyal subjects. Next came the Spanish crown. In January 1556, Charles officially abdicated the crowns of Castile and Aragon, the vast territories in the New World, and the Duchy of Milan, all to Philip II. Philip was now the most powerful monarch in Europe, ruling an empire that stretched from the Americas to Asia. The trickier part was the Holy Roman Empire. Charles formally resigned his imperial title to Ferdinand in August 1556, but the electors did not officially recognize Ferdinand as emperor until February 1558. This delay reflected the delicate balance of power and the need for formal acceptance by the various German princes. Ferdinand I was now Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Archduke of Austria, King of Bohemia, and King of Hungary. He inherited the ongoing struggle against the Ottoman Empire in the East and the complex religious politics of Germany. This formal division, while carefully managed by Charles, set the stage for centuries of separate but interconnected dynastic policies. The Spanish Habsburgs under Philip II focused on maintaining their vast overseas empire, fighting Protestantism and asserting their dominance in Western Europe, often clashing with France and England. The Austrian Habsburgs under Ferdinand I focused on consolidating their power in Central Europe, defending against the Ottomans and navigating the religious divisions within the Holy Roman Empire. Despite the formal split, the two branches of the family remained incredibly close. Marriages between cousins were common, designed to reinforce alliances and keep the bloodlines intertwined. They often supported each other in wars, provided financial aid, and maintained a common front against their traditional enemies, particularly the French Bourbon dynasty. However, their distinct geographical and political priorities sometimes led to divergences in policy, and the rivalry for prestige and influence within the broader Habsburg family continued, albeit in a more subtle diplomatic form. The 1556 division was not just an administrative decision, it was a fundamental reshaping of the most powerful dynasty in Europe, a decision that would dictate alliances, wars, and royal policies for the next 200 years. Number 4. The Brothers' Quarrel. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family found itself in a peculiar and increasingly dangerous situation. At its head sat Emperor Rudolf II, a man of immense learning and artistic sensibility, but also a deeply introverted, melancholic, and ultimately reclusive ruler. Rudolf preferred the quiet solitude of his magnificent castle in Prague, immersing himself in alchemy, astronomy, art collecting, and the study of strange, exotic creatures. He built an astonishing Kunstkammer, a cabinet of curiosities filled with wonders from across the known world. He surrounded himself with scholars, mystics, and artists, creating one of Europe's most vibrant cultural centers. However, his passion for the esoteric came at the cost of his duties as emperor. Rudolf became increasingly detached from the day-to-day governance of his vast complex empire. He avoided public appearances, delayed important decisions for years, and retreated into his own world. This administrative paralysis began to create serious problems. The Holy Roman Empire, already reeling from the religious divisions of the Reformation, needed strong, decisive leadership. The Ottoman Turks were still a formidable threat on the eastern borders, demanding constant vigilance and military funding. Meanwhile, the Protestant princes within the empire were growing restless, feeling their rights were being ignored and fearing a Catholic resurgence. The Habsburg family, known for its tight-knit but often fiercely competitive internal dynamics, watched Rudolf's decline with growing alarm. His younger brothers and cousins, particularly Archduke Matthias, were deeply frustrated. Matthias was the complete opposite of Rudolf. Pragmatic, ambitious, and eager to take charge. He had spent years governing various Habsburg territories, gaining valuable experience, and building a network of alliances. He saw the empire drifting rudderless, and he believed he was the only one who could save it. The brothers' quarrel was not a sudden explosion, but a slow burning fuse, fueled by Rudolf's increasing incompetence and Matthias's growing impatience. The other Habsburg archdukes, seeing the danger, eventually sided with Matthias. They held secret meetings, exchanging letters filled with anxieties about Rudolf's mental state and the stability of the dynasty. They worried not only about their shared family power, but also about the integrity of the Habsburg lands themselves. The first major move came in 1606. A group of archdukes, led by Matthias, formally declared Rudolf incapable of governing and recognized Matthias as the head of the Habsburg family. This was an unprecedented act of defiance against a reigning emperor, a clear challenge to Rudolf's authority. Rudolf, in his proud castle, was furious, but largely helpless. He tried to rally support, but his years of neglect had alienated most of his natural allies. Matthias, with the backing of his brothers and cousins, began to take control of various Habsburg territories. He marched his army into Austria, seizing control of the archduchy. He then moved on to Hungary. The Hungarian nobility, weary of Rudolf's neglect and the ongoing war with the Ottomans, quickly recognized Matthias as their king in 1608. This was a direct usurpation of Rudolf's power. As Hungary was a crown held by the Habsburg emperor, the pressure on Rudolf intensified. He was isolated in Prague, his once loyal advisors now looking to Matthias. In 1608, after years of simmering tension and Matthias's military advances, Rudolf was forced to sign the Treaty of Leoben. This humiliating agreement stripped him of most of his effective power. He formally ceded Hungary, Austria, and Moravia to Matthias. Rudolf was left with only Bohemia, Silesia, and the imperial title itself, which, without his hereditary lands, was largely an empty honor. Even in Bohemia, his authority was shaky. In a desperate attempt to retain some support, Rudolf issued the Letter of Majesty in 1609, granting considerable religious freedom to the Bohemian Protestants. This was a crucial concession, one he would later regret, and one that further complicated the religious landscape of the empire. But the quarrel was not over. Rudolf, despite his diminished power, remained emperor. He resented Matthias's usurpation and continued to plot, hoping to regain his lost authority. He refused to formally abdicate the imperial crown, clinging to his last remaining vestige of power. Matthias, for his part, was eager to complete his takeover and assume the imperial title. The standoff continued for another 3 years, a tense period where two brothers nominally shared power, but one was actively undermining the other. The climax came in 1611. Rudolf, in a last desperate gamble, invited his cousin, Archduke Leopold of Passau, with his army into Bohemia, ostensibly to restore order, but in reality to bolster his own position against Matthias. This move backfired spectacularly. Leopold's undisciplined troops caused chaos, alienating the Bohemian estates. Matthias, seizing the moment, marched his own army into Bohemia. He was welcomed by the Bohemian nobility, who were now completely disillusioned with Rudolf. Matthias entered Prague in triumph, and Rudolf was effectively imprisoned within his own castle, under immense pressure. With his own capital occupied by his brother's troops, Rudolf II was finally forced to abdicate the Bohemian crown to Matthias in 1611. He died just a few months later, in January 1612, a lonely and broken man. Matthias was then elected Holy Roman Emperor Matthias. The brothers' quarrel had come to its conclusion, with the pragmatic ambitious Matthias consolidating power and bringing a brief, if fragile, period of order to the Habsburg domains. However, Rudolf's concessions in Bohemia and the lingering religious tensions created during his ineffective reign had set the stage for an even greater, more destructive conflict that would soon engulf all of Europe. The 30 Years' War. The family feud had been settled, but the empire remained a powder keg ready to explode. Number 5. The Bohemian Succession and the 30 Years' War. The air, in Prague, in the spring of 1618, was thick with tension. For years, the Kingdom of Bohemia, a vital part of the Habsburg dominions, had been a simmering cauldron of religious and political unrest. The majority of the Bohemian nobility and populace were Protestant, following various branches of the Reformation, while the Habsburg rulers, including the current Emperor Matthias, were staunchly Catholic. A fragile peace had been maintained by Rudolf II's Letter of Majesty in 1609, which granted significant religious freedoms to Bohemian Protestants. But that peace was about to shatter. Emperor Matthias, old and childless, had designated his cousin, Ferdinand of Styria, as his heir. Ferdinand was an ardent, uncompromising Catholic, educated by Jesuits, and famously declared that he would rather rule over a desert than over a country full of heretics. The Bohemian Protestant estates watched his rise with extreme alarm. They feared he would revoke the Letter of Majesty and suppress their religious freedoms. Their fears were not unfounded. Ferdinand had already aggressively re-Catholicized his own lands in Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola. The spark that ignited the conflagration came over two specific issues: the construction of new Protestant churches. One at Braunau was closed by the local abbot, and another at Frab was ordered demolished by the Archbishop of Prague. The Bohemian Protestants saw these actions as direct violations of the Letter of Majesty, a clear sign of Ferdinand's future intentions even before he officially became king. They had appealed to Emperor Matthias, but his responses were slow and unsatisfactory. They felt their grievances were being ignored and their rights trampled upon. On May 23, 1618, a group of furious Bohemian Protestant noblemen, led by Count Jindřich Matthias Thurn, marched to Prague Castle. They were demanding answers from the imperial regents who were administering Bohemia. In Matthias's name, they found two of these regents, Wilhelm Slavata and Jaroslav Borita of Martinice, along with their secretary Philip Fabricius. The meeting quickly devolved into a heated argument. The Protestant nobles accused the regents of conspiring against their rights and violating the Letter of Majesty. They declared that these men were enemies of Bohemia, and the dynasty deserving of punishment. What happened next became one of the most infamous moments in European history. In a symbolic act of defiance, echoing an earlier defenestration in Prague in the 15th century, the Bohemian nobles seized the three Catholic officials and literally threw them out of a high window of Prague Castle. Accounts from the time differ on the exact height and the landing. Some say they landed on a pile of manure, others that they survived miraculously, unharmed, which was interpreted by Catholics as divine intervention. Regardless of the messy details, the message was unmistakable and shocking. This was a direct, violent challenge to Habsburg authority, a clear rejection of their appointed officials. It was an act of open rebellion. The defenestration of Prague immediately plunged Bohemia into chaos. The Protestant estates, having committed such a bold act, knew there was no turning back. They quickly formed their own government, raised an army, and formally deposed Ferdinand from the Bohemian throne. This was the ultimate rejection of the Habsburg dynastic claim. In his place, they elected Frederick V, the young Calvinist elector Palatine, as their new king of Bohemia. Frederick, a prominent Protestant prince in the Holy Roman Empire, was also the son-in-law of King James I of England. Accepting the Bohemian crown was a massive gamble for Frederick, one that his own advisors warned him against. It meant directly challenging the power of the Habsburgs and inviting a war of enormous scale. But Frederick, ambitious and perhaps a little naive, saw it as a divine calling to lead the Protestant cause. Emperor Matthias, still alive but frail, was outraged. He called upon Ferdinand to suppress the rebellion. When Matthias died in March 1619, Ferdinand formally became Holy Roman Emperor. Ferdinand II, his determination to crush the Bohemian revolt was absolute. He viewed it not just as a political rebellion, but as an assault on his legitimate dynastic rights and a direct challenge to his Catholic faith. For Ferdinand, this was a holy war. He quickly sought alliances. He secured the crucial support of his cousin, King Philip III of Spain, who sent troops and financial aid. He also gained the backing of the Catholic League, led by Duke Maximilian of Bavaria. Ferdinand's forces under the command of Count Tilly marched into Bohemia. Frederick V, derided as the Winter King because his reign would last only one winter, found himself with limited support. His English father-in-law provided little more than moral encouragement, and many Protestant princes in Germany were hesitant to get involved in what they initially saw as an internal Bohemian affair. The decisive battle came on November 8, 1620, at White Mountain just outside Prague. The Imperial and Catholic League forces utterly routed the Bohemian army. It was a swift, crushing victory for Ferdinand. Frederick V and his family fled, Bohemia becoming exiles. Ferdinand's vengeance was swift. The leaders of the Bohemian revolt were rounded up and executed in Prague's Old Town Square. Thousands of Protestant nobles were exiled, their lands confiscated and redistributed to loyal Catholics. Bohemia was forcibly re-Catholicized, its independence crushed, and its crown firmly re-established as a hereditary possession of the Habsburgs. But the defenestration of Prague and the Bohemian revolt were only the beginning. The brutal suppression and Ferdinand's uncompromising religious policies sent shockwaves throughout the Holy Roman Empire. And beyond, Protestant princes in Germany, seeing the fate of Bohemia, grew increasingly fearful for their own religious and political autonomy. Catholic rulers, encouraged by Ferdinand's success, became more assertive. The conflict quickly escalated beyond Bohemia's borders, drawing in Denmark, Sweden, France, and other European powers, each with their own religious, political, and dynastic agendas. What started as a dispute over Bohemian succession and religious rights morphed into the devastating 30 Years' War, a conflict that ravaged Central Europe, depopulated vast areas, and reshaped the political map of the continent for centuries. The Habsburgs had crushed one challenge to their dynastic power, but at an unimaginable cost. Number 6. The War of the Spanish Succession. The year 1700 marked a terrifying moment for Europe's ruling families. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king of Spain, was slowly, agonizingly dying. He was a deeply unfortunate monarch, sickly and infertile, the product of generations of close inbreeding within the Habsburg family. His very existence was a testament to the family's relentless pursuit of dynastic purity. But it also ensured its ultimate biological end in Spain. For decades, Europe had watched Charles's decline, knowing that his death would unleash a monumental struggle over his vast inheritance. The Spanish Empire was still enormous. It included Spain itself, rich colonies in the Americas, the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, Milan, Naples, and Sicily. It was a prize that could tip the balance of power in Europe definitively. Two great dynastic houses had legitimate, albeit complex, claims to this inheritance: the Austrian Habsburgs and the French Bourbons. On one side stood Emperor Leopold I, the head of the Austrian Habsburgs. He was Charles II's first cousin, and also his uncle through various intermarriages. Leopold believed the Spanish inheritance should remain with the Habsburg family, specifically passing to his second son, Archduke Charles. For Leopold, maintaining the family's traditional strength and preventing a vast increase in French power was paramount. On the other side was King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, at the height of his power and ambition. His wife, Maria Theresa, was Charles II's elder half-sister, and Louis himself was Charles's first cousin. Once removed, Louis XIV had famously married Maria Theresa on the condition that she renounce her rights to the Spanish throne in exchange for a massive dowry. However, that dowry had never been fully paid, giving Louis a legal pretext to argue that the renunciation was void. Louis wanted the Spanish throne for his grandson Philip, Duke of Anjou. A Bourbon on the Spanish throne would mean French dominance across Europe, effectively encircling the Austrian Habsburgs and controlling vast colonial riches. For years leading up to Charles II's death, European diplomacy was a dizzying dance of proposed partitions and secret treaties, all designed to prevent any one power from gaining too much. But Charles II himself, in a final desperate attempt to keep his empire intact and avoid its dismemberment, made a surprising and controversial decision: In his last will, coerced by pro-French factions at his court and advised by the Pope, Charles named Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, as his sole heir. The will explicitly stipulated that the French and Spanish crowns must never be united, but this was a thin promise to nervous European powers. When Charles II finally died in November 1700, Louis XIV was faced with a momentous choice: accept the will, placing his grandson on the Spanish throne, and risking a pan-European war, or abide by earlier partition treaties which would have given portions of the Spanish Empire to the Austrian Habsburgs and other powers. Louis, ever the proud and ambitious monarch, famously declared, "There are no longer Pyrenees." As he accepted the will, his grandson Philip became Philip V of Spain. This act sent shockwaves across Europe. Emperor Leopold I was outraged, feeling betrayed and robbed of his family's rightful inheritance. England and the Dutch Republic, deeply concerned by the prospect of a Bourbon superpower dominating the continent and controlling the lucrative Spanish trade routes, quickly formed an alliance with the Austrian Habsburgs. Thus, the Grand Alliance was formed, determined to challenge Philip V's claim and place Archduke Charles on the Spanish throne. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted in 1701, a monumental conflict that would engulf Europe for over a decade. It was a truly global war fought on multiple fronts: in Spain itself, in Italy, in the Spanish Netherlands, and across the seas, in the colonies. The sheer scale of the fighting was unprecedented. Legendary commanders emerged, such as the Duke of Marlborough for England, and Prince Eugene of Savoy for the Habsburgs, who would inflict crushing defeats on the French at battles like Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, and Malplaquet. The war was incredibly complex, marked by shifting alliances, massive sieges, and brutal pitched battles. In Spain, the war was a civil conflict, as much as an international, when regions like Aragon and Catalan support in Timpa. For the Habsburgs, it was a fight for the very future of their dynasty's power and prestige. For Louis XIV, it was a gamble for ultimate European supremacy. However, the tide of war began to turn. Exhaustion set in for all parties. Furthermore, a critical event in 1711 changed the entire dynamic. Emperor Leopold I had died earlier, and his elder son Joseph I had succeeded him, but then Joseph I suddenly died of smallpox, leaving Archduke Charles as the sole surviving male heir of the Austrian Habsburg line. If Charles were to become Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, he would effectively recreate the vast empire of Charles V, a prospect that was just as alarming to England and the Dutch Republic as a unified Bourbon power. This development made the Grand Alliance less committed to placing Charles on the Spanish throne. With the balance of power now in mind, peace negotiations gained momentum. The series of treaties known as the Peace of Utrecht in 1713 and the Treaty of Rastatt in 1714 finally brought the long, bloody war to an end. Philip V was recognized as King of Spain, but on the strict condition that the French and Spanish crowns would never be united. Spain lost its territories in Italy and the Spanish Netherlands, which were largely transferred to the Austrian Habsburgs. England gained significant territorial and commercial advantages, including Gibraltar and control of the Asiento, the lucrative slave trade. The War of the Spanish Succession, born from the death of one king and the ambition of two powerful dynasties, profoundly reshaped the map of Europe. It established a new balance of power, curbing French ambitions and elevating the Austrian Habsburgs to a more focused Central European power, while still keeping Spain separate. The Spanish Habsburg line had ended, but its legacy continued to fuel the rivalries of their European cousins for generations. Number 7. The Hungarian Rákóczi's War of Independence. The early 18th century was a time of immense change and often violent upheaval in the Habsburg monarchy. While the War of the Spanish Succession raged in Western Europe, a different, equally bitter struggle was unfolding in the East. Hungary's desperate fight for independence against Habsburg rule. For centuries, the Kingdom of Hungary had been a battleground, ravaged by Ottoman occupation for over 150 years, and then slowly reconquered by the Habsburgs. Its people, nobility, and culture bore the scars of perpetual conflict. The Habsburgs, as kings of Hungary, saw it as a vital bulwark against the Ottomans and a crucial source of revenue and soldiers. However, they ruled it often with a heavy hand, ignoring local customs, imposing high taxes, and attempting to curb the traditional rights of the Hungarian nobility, often favoring German-speaking officials. This simmering resentment boiled over repeatedly, but it found its most formidable leader in Ferenc II. Rákóczi was no ordinary nobleman. He came from one of Hungary's most ancient and powerful families, a family that had consistently championed Hungarian liberty and Protestantism against Habsburg Catholic rule. His grandfather and great-grandfather had both been princes of Transylvania, a semi-independent state that often served as a focal point for Hungarian resistance. Rákóczi himself had been carefully educated in Habsburg courts, designed to turn him into a loyal subject. But his Hungarian identity and the grievances of his people ran deep. The immediate trigger for the uprising in 1703 was a combination of factors. The Habsburg Emperor Leopold I, focused on the War of the Spanish Succession, was drawing heavily on Hungarian resources and manpower. Austrian military commanders, known as the Labank, were often seen as occupiers, abusing the populace and ignoring their rights. Furthermore, Protestant Hungarians faced renewed pressure from Catholicizing policies. A long-standing complaint was the Hungarian nobility's demand for the restoration of their constitutional rights, including the right to elect their own king, not merely accept the hereditary Habsburg rule. They chafed under centralized Habsburg administration, which sought to integrate Hungary more fully into the Austrian hereditary lands. Ferenc Rákóczi, having been previously imprisoned by the Habsburgs for suspected conspiracy, managed to escape and found refuge in Poland. From there, he began to organize a rebellion, rallying support from disaffected Hungarian peasants, impoverished nobles, and former soldiers. He issued a manifesto, Recrudescant Vulnera Antiqua, meaning the old wounds bleed again, appealing to all Hungarians for freedom and justice. He promised to restore their ancient liberties and protect their religious freedoms. His movement, known as the Kuruk Rebellion, quickly gained momentum. These were not professional armies, but passionate, often poorly equipped, but fiercely determined fighters. They relied on swift movements, guerrilla tactics, and the deep local knowledge of the Hungarian countryside. Rákóczi proved to be an inspiring and capable leader, skillfully navigating the complex internal politics of Hungary and securing some initial successes against the Habsburg forces. The Habsburgs, stretched thin by the War of the Spanish Succession, were initially caught off guard. They had to divert precious resources and troops to suppress the Hungarian rebellion, a frustrating distraction for Emperor Leopold I, and later his son Joseph I. The war in Hungary became a brutal, destructive conflict, marked by scorched earth tactics, sieges, and widespread devastation. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and the civilian population suffered immensely. Rákóczi's greatest diplomatic move was securing the support of King Louis XIV of France. Louis, always eager to destabilize his Habsburg rivals, provided financial aid and some military advice to the Hungarian rebels. This alliance transformed the Hungarian conflict from a regional rebellion into a crucial strategic front of the wider European conflict. French money helped keep the Kuruk army in the field, and the diversion of Habsburg troops to Hungary eased pressure on the French fronts in the west. The Rákóczi uprising became a true war of independence, where the very legitimacy of Habsburg rule in Hungary was questioned. Rákóczi was elected ruling Prince of Transylvania, and later proclaimed himself Prince of Hungary, directly challenging the Habsburg claim to the Hungarian crown. He even attempted to forge a separate Hungarian foreign policy, seeking recognition from other European powers. Despite initial successes, the tide began to turn against Rákóczi. The Habsburgs, once their hands were freed up by some successes in the Spanish Succession War, the Kuruk forces, while brave, lacked the training, equipment, and sustained financial backing of a major European power. Furthermore, internal divisions began to plague the Hungarian rebel movement. Not all Hungarian nobles were fully committed to complete independence. Some simply wanted a restoration of their traditional rights within the Habsburg framework. The peace faction grew stronger, weary of the endless war. The major turning point came in 1708, when the Kuruk army suffered a significant defeat at the Battle of Trenčín. This loss severely weakened Rákóczi's forces and morale. The Habsburg Emperor, Joseph I, a more pragmatic ruler than his father, recognized the need for a diplomatic solution to avoid prolonged internal conflict. He offered a general amnesty to the rebels and promised to respect the constitutional rights of Hungary as long as they recognized the hereditary rule of the Habsburg dynasty. Negotiations began, leading to the Treaty of Szatmár in 1711. This treaty marked the official end of Rákóczi's War of Independence. It granted amnesty to the rebels, secured religious freedom for Protestants, and confirmed many of Hungary's traditional rights and privileges. In return, the Hungarian estates formally accepted the hereditary right of the Habsburgs to the Hungarian throne. Ferenc Rákóczi himself refused to accept the terms of the peace, believing it did not go far enough to secure full Hungarian independence. He chose exile, living in Poland, France, and eventually the Ottoman Empire, where he died in 1735. Though the rebellion failed to achieve full independence for Hungary, it forced the Habsburgs to adopt a more conciliatory approach to their Hungarian subjects. It secured important constitutional guarantees and highlighted the ongoing tension within the Habsburg composite monarchy, a tension between centralized control and regional autonomy, a dispute that would continue to shape the dynasty's relationship with its diverse lands for centuries. Number 8. The War of the Austrian Succession. The year 1740 was supposed to be a moment of peaceful transition for the vast Habsburg monarchy. Emperor Charles VI, the last male Habsburg of his line, had spent his entire reign obsessed with one goal: ensuring his daughter Maria Theresa would inherit all his dominions intact. He had no sons, and the laws of the Holy Roman Empire and many of his hereditary lands did not traditionally allow for female succession. To overcome this, Charles had painstakingly drafted and tirelessly negotiated the Pragmatic Sanction, a legal document that declared the Habsburg lands indivisible and established Maria Theresa's right to inherit them all. He had spent decades buttering up European monarchs, making concessions and signing treaties, all to secure their recognition of this critical document. Most of the major European powers, including France, Spain, Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain, had formally agreed to respect it. Charles died in October 1740, convinced he had secured his daughter's future. He could not have been more wrong. Maria Theresa, a spirited, intelligent, and fiercely determined woman of 23, found herself in a desperate position almost immediately. She was pregnant with her fourth child when her father died. Despite all the promises and treaties, no sooner had Charles VI breathed his last than a pack of ambitious European rulers who had previously signed the Pragmatic Sanction smelled weakness and opportunity. They decided to challenge her claim, not because of some deep ideological disagreement, but because they saw a young woman on the throne as a chance to grab valuable Habsburg territory. The first, and most audacious to strike, was Frederick II of Prussia, later known as Frederick the Great. Frederick was a ruthless pragmatist, a brilliant military strategist, and a man with a burning ambition to elevate Prussia from a middling power to a great European force. He saw Maria Theresa's inexperience and the perceived weakness of the Habsburg army as an irresistible invitation. Without any formal declaration of war, or even a credible legal pretext, Frederick launched his forces into Silesia, a rich, industrially developed province of the Habsburg monarchy. In December 1740, This shocking act of aggression lit the fuse of what would become the War of the Austrian Succession. Frederick's invasion was a massive blow to Maria Theresa, who had barely begun to organize her government. Her treasury was depleted, her army was scattered and ill-prepared, and her advisors were often divided. The Prussian invasion emboldened other claimants. Charles Albert, the Elector of Bavaria, put forward his own claim to the Habsburg lands, arguing a distant genealogical connection and seeking the imperial crown for himself. France, under King Louis XV, saw an opportunity to finally weaken its ancient Habsburg rival and formed an alliance with Bavaria and Prussia. Soon Spain, Saxony, and Sardinia also joined the anti-Habsburg coalition, all hoping to carve up the vast Austrian inheritance. Maria Theresa found herself surrounded by enemies. Almost universally underestimated, her position seemed hopeless. She famously rode to Pressburg, modern-day Bratislava, in Hungary, where she faced the Hungarian Diet in 1741. Dressed in mourning, with her infant son Joseph in her arms, she delivered a passionate speech in Latin, appealing to the Hungarian nobility for their loyalty. She reminded them of their ancient oath to defend the Habsburg dynasty. The Hungarian nobles, touched by her plight, and perhaps seeing an opportunity to secure greater autonomy for themselves, rose to the occasion. They famously pledged vitam et sanguinem, meaning our lives and blood. They raised an army, providing Maria Theresa with crucial military support when she needed it most. The early years of the war were disastrous for Maria Theresa. Her armies suffered defeats. Bavaria and France invaded Austria, even occupying parts of Bohemia and laying siege to Prague. Charles Albert of Bavaria was even elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1742, a devastating blow to Habsburg prestige, as the imperial crown had rested almost exclusively. She was tenacious, resilient, and utterly dedicated to preserving her inheritance for her children. She displayed remarkable political skill, managing her generals, rallying her disparate peoples, and seeking out allies. Britain, ever concerned with the balance of power and fearful of French dominance, provided crucial financial subsidies and naval support. They saw Maria Theresa as the bulwark against Bourbon power in Europe. The war became a global conflict, with battles fought in Flanders, Italy, Germany, and even in the colonies. In North America, King George's War. The fighting was brutal and protracted. Battles like Dettingen in 1743, where Maria Theresa's Anglo-Hanoverian and Austrian forces scored a victory, and Fontenoy in 1745, a major French victory, marked the ebb and flow of the bloody conflict. Maria Theresa proved to be an astute administrator, reforming her military and securing vital resources. She also learned valuable lessons from her defeats, understanding that her Habsburg lands needed strengthening and modernization to compete with rising powers, like Prussia. By 1745, things started to turn. Charles Albert, the Bavarian emperor, died, and his son made peace with Maria Theresa, recognizing her claims. Frederick the Great, having secured Silesia, temporarily withdrew from the conflict. The French, despite their victories, found themselves bogged down and financially exhausted. After 8 long years of devastating warfare, the major powers were ready for peace. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was signed in 1748. Maria Theresa was formally recognized as the legitimate ruler of all the Habsburg dominions, and her husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, who had become Grand Duke of Tuscany, was recognized as Holy Roman Emperor. The Pragmatic Sanction was finally unequivocally accepted by all European powers. However, Maria Theresa was forced to make one significant concession. Silesia, her most valuable industrial province, remained in Prussian hands. This loss would forever rankle Maria Theresa and set the stage for the next major European conflict, the 7 Years' War, as she desperately sought to regain her lost territory. The War of the Austrian Succession was a monumental dynastic dispute. born from one woman's contested inheritance. It proved Maria Theresa's mettle, destabilized rulers, and cemented the Habsburg dynasty's hold on its traditional lands, even if it did come at the cost of a significant piece of its territory and immense human suffering across the continent.